You don't even understand what I just said, do you? The man's voice carried just enough volume to ripple across the dining room, smooth and polished like the crystal glass he held, but edged with something colder beneath it, something deliberate, something meant to be heard. Conversation softened, silverware paused mid-air, and under the warm glow of chandelier light, every eye within 10 feet subtly shifted toward table 12. Richard Vaughan sat there like he owned not just the table, but the air around it, tailored navy suit, cufflinks catching the light, posture relaxed with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Across from him, a half-finished glass of Bordeaux rested untouched, its deep red surface trembling slightly from the faint vibration of the room. Standing beside him, tray balanced carefully in one hand, Lila Carter didn't answer right away. She had heard every word. Every syllable of the rapid, elegant French he had just delivered, the kind of order designed less to communicate and more to perform. She also heard the soft chuckle from the couple 2 tables over, the subtle shift of the manager near the bar, already watching, already calculating. Lila's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, just enough for the porcelain plates to whisper against each other, but her face remained still, composed, unreadable. Richard leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, his lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, he added, this time in English, slower, clearer, as if speaking to someone who needed the help. Should I repeat it? A faint heat crept up the back of Lila's neck, but it stopped there. It didn't reach her expression. It didn't reach her voice. Not yet. The manager took a step forward from across the room, his posture tight, rehearsed, ready to intervene if needed, but also ready to protect the man at the table more than the girl beside it. Lila noticed. She always noticed. The polished floors reflected the soft golden light above, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which version of her would answer. The quiet one. Or the one who remembered. Her thumb brushed lightly against the worn bracelet on her wrist, a thin band of faded leather with a small, tarnished charm, something old, something out of place in a room like this. She didn't look down at it, but she felt it. The weight of it. The memory of voices that spoke in more than one language, of long nights filled with books instead of sleep, of correction not with ridicule, but with patience. Richard exhaled through his nose, amused now, glancing briefly at his companion as if to share the moment. It's not complicated, he said, tapping a finger lightly against the menu. But I suppose, Lila finally moved. Not quickly. Not nervously. She set the tray down on the edge of the table with quiet precision, the soft contact of porcelain against polished wood cutting cleanly through the tension in the air. Then she lifted her gaze to meet his. Direct. Steady. Unflinching. For the first time, the room seemed to shift in a way no one could quite explain, like the balance had tilted just a fraction, too subtle to name, but impossible to ignore. And still, she hadn't spoken. Not yet. Actually, Lila said softly, her voice steady and clear, carrying just enough to reach him without disturbing the fragile silence around them, you asked for the 2016 Chateau Margaux, decanted for exactly 20 minutes, served slightly below room temperature, and you specified that the steak be prepared medium rare, not medium, with the sauce on the side, not over the top. The words flowed in precise, effortless French, each vowel shaped with quiet confidence, each consonant landing exactly where it should, not rushed, not hesitant, but measured in a way that felt practiced, intentional, undeniable. For a brief second, nothing moved. The low hum of the dining room seemed to thin, like sound itself had stepped back to listen. Richard's fingers, which had been idly resting against the stem of his glass, stilled. His expression did not collapse, not immediately, but something subtle shifted beneath it, something almost imperceptible, like a crack forming beneath polished stone. He had expected confusion, maybe an apology. Perhaps even a nervous laugh, but not this. Never this. Lila continued, still in French, her tone respectful, never mocking, yet carrying a quiet authority that did not ask for permission. However, sir, the vintage you requested is currently unavailable this evening. I was about to recommend a 2015 from the same region, which holds a similar profile but with a slightly more pronounced structure. A man seated 2 tables away, who had been silently observing, lowered his fork and leaned back, his brows lifting with quiet interest. He understood every word. So did the woman beside him, who exchanged a glance that said more than either of them dared to speak out loud. Richard blinked once, slowly, as if recalibrating, then let out a short, controlled breath. "Is that so?" he replied, this time in English, though the confidence in his voice no longer carried the same effortless edge. He straightened slightly in his chair, adjusting his cuff as though resetting the moment, as though reclaiming something that had slipped. "And you are certain you understood me correctly?" It was not a question. It was a test. Lila met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, sir," she answered, her tone calm, professional, grounded. Then, just a beat later, she added, gently, though you did pronounce Mogo with a hard G, which is not standard. The correction landed lightly, almost politely, but it did not disappear. It lingered in the air between them, quiet and unmistakable. A faint shift passed through the nearby tables, not laughter, not quite, but something close to it, something restrained, something careful. Richard's jaw tightened for the smallest fraction of a second, a movement so brief most would have missed it, but Lila did not. She saw it. She always saw the moments people tried to hide. He reached for his glass, lifting it, though he did not drink. "I see," he said, his voice smoother now, but thinner, like a layer stretched too far. "Well, then perhaps we should keep things simple." But the word simple did not carry the same meaning it had moments ago. Not anymore. Across the room, the manager stopped mid-step, uncertain now, his earlier confidence replaced with hesitation, as though the script he had expected to follow no longer applied. Lila remained still, her posture straight, her expression composed, but inside, something had already shifted. Not victory. Not yet. Just alignment. Just truth, spoken clearly and left to stand on its own. And for the first time since he had spoken, Richard Vaughan was no longer entirely in control of the room. Richard Vaughan set the glass back down with deliberate care, the faint click against the table sharper than it should have been, as though the sound itself had gained weight, and for a moment he said nothing, only studied her, really studied her now, not as part of the background, not as a role, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and that alone unsettled him more than he intended to show. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the edge of the table, his voice lowering. Just enough to pull the moment inward instead of letting it drift away. "All right," he said, almost conversational now, "let us try something else," and without waiting for acknowledgement, he shifted back into another language, this time Italian, faster, more technical, layered with specific terminology that most casual speakers would not recognize, referencing a lesser-known vineyard, a particular aging method, and a pairing that required more than surface knowledge to follow. It was not just an order, it was a challenge dressed as one, and this time there was no smile when he finished, only expectation, sharp and quiet, like a line drawn across the table. The nearby diners felt it too, the subtle tightening of attention, the sense that whatever came next would not be easily dismissed. Lila did not move right away, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing steady, her eyes never leaving his, and for a brief second, the room seemed to narrow again, the edges softening. While the space between them sharpened, she heard every word, not just the language, but the intention behind it, the need to regain control, to re-establish hierarchy, to turn the moment back into something familiar, something safe for him. Her thumb brushed once more against the worn bracelet at her wrist, the small charm catching the light as she shifted her weight almost imperceptibly. Then she spoke, and when she did, it was not rushed, not defensive, but precise, fluent Italian, clear and grounded, each phrase delivered with the same quiet authority as before. "The vineyard you mentioned," she began, "actually adjusted their aging process 3 years ago, so the profile you are expecting would be closer to their earlier releases, not the current one." She paused just long enough for the information to land, then continued, still calm, still respectful. "If you are looking for that balance, I would recommend a Barolo from the same region, though it should be allowed to breathe longer than what you suggested." There was no edge in her tone, no attempt to embarrass, only clarity, but clarity, in this moment, was enough. A soft murmur moved through the tables nearby, not loud, not disruptive, but present, the kind of sound that could not be pulled back once released. Richard's Expression shifted again, slower this time, the confidence still there, but no longer unshaken. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still. He had expected resistance perhaps, or even compliance, but not correction, not this level of detail, not from someone he had already decided did not belong in his world. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, recalibrating again, choosing his next move more carefully now. Across the room, the manager had fully paused, his earlier urgency gone, replaced by something closer to uncertainty, as though stepping in now would disrupt something he no longer understood. Lila remained exactly where she was, posture steady, gaze level, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply present, and in that stillness, something else became visible, not to everyone, but to those who were paying attention. The quiet shift of power that does not announce itself, that does not demand recognition, but settles into place all the same. And for the first time that evening, Richard Vaughan was not testing her to see if she would fail, he was listening to see if he already had. Richard Vaughan did not reach for his glass this time. Instead he folded his hands slowly on the table, fingers interlacing with a precision that mirrored the way he had built his empire, controlled, calculated, never accidental. But there was a pause now, a fraction longer than before, as though something inside him had shifted from performance to assessment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not softer, but more focused. "You seem very confident," he said, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in anger, but in curiosity sharpened by pride. "For someone in your position," the words hovered in the space between them, not loud enough to draw new attention, but deliberate enough that those already watching leaned in just a little more. Lila did not react to the phrasing, not to the implication, not to the weight of it. Instead she inclined her head a fraction, acknowledging the statement without accepting its premise. "I try to be accurate, sir," she replied evenly, her tone grounded, unshaken. And for a moment, the simplicity of the response seemed to disrupt him more than any challenge would have, because it gave him nothing to push against, nothing to dismiss, nothing to dominate. Richard exhaled slowly, then leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting briefly across the room before returning to her, as if measuring not just her, but the invisible shift that had begun to ripple outward. The couple at the adjacent table had stopped pretending not to listen. The man with the fork, still resting midair, now set it down completely, his attention fully claimed by the exchange. Even the low jazz playing through the speakers seemed to fade into the background, reduced to a distant hum beneath the tension. "Tell me," Richard continued, his voice steady, controlled, but edged with something new now, something closer to genuine inquiry. "Where exactly did you learn all of this?" It was not a challenge this time, not entirely, but it was not neutral either. It carried the expectation of a boundary, of a story that would restore the balance he understood. Lila's fingers brushed once more against the bracelet at her wrist, the worn leather soft against her skin, the small charm catching a glint of light as she shifted slightly, and for the first time since the exchange began, there was a flicker of something behind her composed expression, not hesitation, but memory, something deeper than the moment, something older. She did not look away, but her voice, when she answered, carried a quiet weight that had not been there before. "From someone who believed that understanding should never depend on where you stand in a room," she said. The word simple, but anchored in something that did not need explanation. Richard's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition that the answer did not fit neatly into the categories he preferred. It did not explain her away, it did not reduce her to something manageable, and that unsettled him more than he expected. He tapped his finger once against the table, then stopped, as though catching himself in the habit. Across the room, the manager finally took a step forward, then hesitated again, unsure whether to interrupt or observe, caught between protocol and the undeniable shift unfolding in front of him. Lila remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and in that stillness, something else began to take shape, not confrontation, not defiance, but clarity, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. Richard studied her for another moment, longer this time, and when he spoke again, there was no trace of mockery left, only a measured tone that hinted at something he had not intended to bring into the evening, respect, though he had not yet named it. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "I should reconsider my order." The words were simple, almost casual, but they carried a weight that shifted the air once more, not as sharply as before, but deeper, more lasting. And for the first time since he had spoken that first sentence, Richard Vaughan was no longer trying to prove anything, he was trying to understand. Richard Vaughan's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, as if committing something to memory that he had not expected to find. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to dismiss her, but to acknowledge the shift that had already taken place. And when he spoke again, his tone carried none of the earlier edge, only a measured calm that felt unfamiliar even to him. "Then I will take your recommendation," he said, each word deliberate, as though he understood now that what he chose next would define more than just a meal. Lila inclined her head slightly, not triumphant, not surprised, simply accepting the decision with the same quiet professionalism she had held from the beginning. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady, and as she reached for her tray, the soft movement of porcelain against wood seemed to release the tension that had been coiled in the air, not completely, but enough for the room to breathe again. Conversations began to return in low murmurs, though not as they had before. Something had changed, something that could not be undone. As Lila turned to step away, the manager finally approached, his expression tight but controlled, the practiced smile not quite settling into place. "Lila," he said quietly, stopping just short of her path, his voice low enough to remain private but firm enough to carry authority. "A word." She paused, shifting the tray slightly in her hand, then turned to face him, her posture still composed. "Of course," she said, and Richard watched this exchange with a focus he had not intended to maintain, his attention no longer drifting, no longer divided. The manager leaned in slightly, lowering his voice further. "You need to be careful," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Richard before returning to her. "He is not just any guest." The implication hung there, familiar, expected, the same invisible line that had been drawn countless times before. Lila listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, and when he finished, she gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I understand," she replied, her tone even, respectful, but not diminished. The manager hesitated for a fraction of a second, as though expecting more, an apology perhaps, or a shift in her demeanor, but none came, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. He straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket. "Just make sure the service remains appropriate," he added, the pause before the last word carrying more weight than the word itself. Lila held his gaze for a brief moment, then said simply, "It will," and with that, she turned back toward the service station, her steps measured, unhurried, leaving behind a silence that lingered longer than it should have. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table again, then stilled, his eyes following her as she moved through the room with quiet efficiency, greeting another table, adjusting a setting. Her composure unchanged, as though the moment that had just unfolded had not shaken her at all, and yet he knew better now, not that she was unaffected, but that she was grounded in something he had not taken the time to understand before. The man seated 2 tables away leaned slightly toward his companion, whispering something that drew a small, knowing smile, while across the room, the manager remained still for a moment longer, watching Lila with a look that was no longer just supervisory, but uncertain. Recalculating, as if trying to determine where exactly she now stood within a structure he thought he understood, Richard reached for his glass again, this time taking a slow sip, the wine no longer the center of his attention, merely a detail in a moment that had shifted into something else entirely, and as he set it down, his gaze lifted once more toward the service station where Lila stood, her hand resting briefly on the counter, the small bracelet at her wrist catching the light again, and for reasons he could not yet explain, that detail stayed with him, more than the languages, more than the correction, more than the challenge itself. It was the quiet certainty in the way she carried herself, the absence of hesitation, the presence of something earned, something built, something real, and for the first time in a long time, Richard Vaughan found himself not thinking about what he owned, but about what he had overlooked. The restaurant settled into a quieter rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm it had held before. Something beneath the surface had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, like a current running just below still water, and Richard Vaughan felt it even as he tried to return his attention to the familiar details in front of him, the polished silverware, the folded linen napkin, the soft glow of the chandelier reflecting off the rim of his glass. He had spent years mastering rooms like this, controlling them without raising his voice, shaping outcomes with a glance or a pause. But now there was something in this space that did not respond to him in the same way, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His gaze drifted again toward the service station where Lila stood, speaking quietly with another server, her posture relaxed but purposeful, her movements efficient, nothing wasted, nothing rushed, and yet there was a composure to her that did not belong to someone simply following instructions. It belonged to someone who understood more than what her role required, someone who carried knowledge not as decoration, but as foundation, and that distinction lingered in his mind longer than he expected. A server approached his table with a fresh set of cutlery, placing it with careful precision, but Richard barely noticed, his thoughts circling something else entirely, the way she had spoken, not to impress, not to challenge, but to clarify, as if truth itself had been enough, and for a man who had built his life on leverage and perception, that simplicity felt almost unfamiliar. Across the room, a man in his late 50s, dressed in a charcoal suit with a neatly folded pocket square, leaned slightly toward his companion, his voice low but audible enough to carry in fragments. Her accent, he murmured, that was not taught in a classroom. The woman beside him nodded, her eyes following Lila as well. No, she replied softly, that was lived. The words drifted just enough to reach Richard, and though he did not turn his head, he heard them, and they settled into his thoughts like a missing piece he had not known to look for. A few minutes later, Lila returned to his table, the bottle of wine in hand, its label turned outward. With practiced precision, the soft light catching the embossed lettering as she presented it. Your selection, sir, she said, her voice even, her presence steady, and for a moment, Richard did not respond immediately, not because he had not heard her, but because he was studying something else. The way she held the bottle, the angle of her wrist, the quiet confidence in her stance, these were not rehearsed movements, they were owned, refined, internalized. He gave a small nod. Go ahead, he said, his tone neutral but attentive. Lila opened the bottle with smooth efficiency, the soft pop of the cork barely audible over the low music. She poured a small amount into his glass, then stepped back half a pace, allowing space without withdrawing presence. Richard lifted the glass, watching the deep red liquid catch the light before bringing it to his lips. He tasted it, paused, then set the glass down with a slow, deliberate motion. You were right, he said, the word simple, unadorned, but carrying a weight that did not go unnoticed. Lila inclined her head slightly. Thank you, sir, she replied, her tone unchanged. But there was something in the air now that had not been there before. Not tension, not quite, but recognition, quiet and growing. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes lifting to meet hers again. You said you learned from someone, he continued, his voice steady, but this time there was no test in it, only curiosity, measured and real. Who was that? The question lingered between them, no longer a demand, but an opening. Lila's fingers brushed the bracelet at her wrist once more, the small charm glinting faintly under the light, and for a brief moment, her gaze softened, not in weakness, but in memory. My father, she said, her voice calm, but carrying a depth that shifted the space again. He believed that language was not just about words, but about respect, about listening, about seeing people clearly. Richard held her gaze, the answer settling into him in a way he had not expected. It did not fit the assumptions he had made. It did not align with the narrative he had constructed in seconds when she first approached his table, and that realization, quiet as it was, began to reshape something deeper than the moment itself. Across the room, the manager watched again, but this time his expression was no longer tight with control. It was uncertain, almost cautious, as though he was witnessing a shift he could not interrupt. Lila remained composed, her posture steady, her presence grounded, and as she stood there, the bracelet at her wrist catching the light once more, it no longer seemed like a small detail, but a symbol of something larger, something carried, something earned. And for the first time in years, Richard Vaughan found himself in a position he rarely occupied, not above, not in control, but in the presence of something he needed to understand before he could define it. Richard Vaughan did not look away when she said it, when she spoke of her father, the word itself landing with a quiet weight that seemed to stretch beyond the table, beyond the room, settling somewhere deeper, and for a moment he did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because the answer required something he was not used to offering: time, reflection, restraint. He lifted his glass again, more slowly this time, taking a measured sip as though grounding himself in something familiar, but the taste did not hold his attention the way it had before. His thoughts remained with her words, with the idea of learning not for display, but for understanding, a concept that felt almost foreign in the context of how he had built his world. Your father must have been, he began, then paused, searching for a word that did not reduce what she had just described. Remarkable, he finished, the word simple, but chosen carefully. Lila gave a small nod, not out of politeness, but acknowledgement. He was, she said, and there was no embellishment in her tone, no need to convince, only certainty, and that certainty carried more weight than any explanation could have. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, but different, the kind that allowed something to settle rather than forcing it to move on. Around them, the restaurant continued, but even the returning conversation seemed softer now, as though the room itself had adjusted to a new center, one that did not revolve around status or expectation, but around something quieter, more grounded. Richard set his glass down and leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more, not to avoid her, but to consider the space differently, the people, the details he had overlooked before, the servers moving with practiced rhythm, the guests absorbed in their own worlds, and then back to her, standing with the same composure, the same quiet presence that had not wavered from the moment she first approached his table. "And yet you are here," he said, not as a criticism, but as an observation, though it carried the echo of a question he had not fully formed. Lila did not flinch at the implication. She had heard it before, in different forms, in different rooms, but always with the same underlying assumption, that where she stood did not match what she knew. She met his gaze evenly. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice calm. Then after a brief pause, she added, "For now." The words were simple, but they shifted the meaning entirely. They did not deny her present, but they did not confine her to it either. Richard's brow lifted slightly, the smallest hint of surprise breaking through his composed exterior, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she said them, without hesitation, without doubt, as if the future she saw did not require validation from the room she stood in, and that certainty, quiet as it was, unsettled something deeper than pride. It touched something closer to recognition. Across the room, the man in the charcoal suit leaned back again, watching with renewed interest, while the manager remained near the edge of the floor, no longer stepping forward, no longer intervening, as if he understood now that whatever was unfolding could not be managed through instruction or control. Lila shifted the tray slightly in her hand, preparing to step away, but Richard spoke again before she could. "Miss Carter," he said, using her name for the first time, and the change, subtle as it was, did not go unnoticed, not by her, not by anyone paying attention. She paused, turning back toward him, her posture unchanged, but her attention fully present. "Yes, sir," she replied, and for a moment, Richard seemed to weigh his next words more carefully than any he had spoken that evening, not because they were complicated, but because they were unfamiliar. "I misjudged you," he said finally, the statement direct, unadorned, and carrying a sincerity that could not be disguised. The room did not fall silent this time, but something in the air shifted again, quieter, deeper, more lasting. Lila held his gaze for a brief moment, then inclined her head slightly, not accepting or rejecting the statement, but acknowledging it for what it was. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her voice steady, and in that exchange, simple as it seemed, something else changed, something that could not be undone, not by either of them. And as she turned to continue her work, the bracelet at her wrist catching the light once more, it no longer marked where she came from, but where she was going. And for the first time that evening, Richard Vaughan did not see a server walking away from his table. He saw someone moving forward beyond it. The moment she walked away, the space she left behind did not close, it lingered, like a quiet echo that refused to fade, and Richard Vaughan remained seated, his posture unchanged, yet something within him no longer aligned with the version of himself that had first spoken that evening. His fingers rested against the edge of the table, still now, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, but absorbing, processing, recalibrating. He watched her as she moved across the room, not with scrutiny, not with judgment, but with a kind of attention he had rarely given to anyone outside his own circle. She stopped at another table, leaning slightly to listen, her expression attentive, her movements precise, and though the interaction was routine, there was nothing mechanical about it. There was presence in it, intention, and that detail stayed with him. Across the dining room, the man in the charcoal suit finally spoke louder than before, not enough to disrupt, but enough that those nearby could hear. "That young woman," he said, setting his glass down, "she trained under Professor Elijah Carter." The name hung in the air for a fraction of a second before recognition sparked in the eyes of his companion. "The linguist," she replied, her voice soft but certain, "the one who published on cross-cultural semantics." The man nodded. "The same," he said. "I attended one of his lectures years ago. He was extraordinary." Richard's gaze shifted slightly, not toward them directly, but enough to catch the conversation, the name settling into his thoughts with a weight that connected something he had not yet fully seen. "Carter," he repeated it silently, aligning it with the name he had just spoken, "Miss Carter." And for the first time, the bracelet at her wrist, the quiet certainty in her voice, the depth behind her words, they began to form a clearer picture, not complete, but no longer abstract. The manager approached again, slower this time, his earlier urgency replaced by something closer to caution. He stopped at the edge of Richard's table, his posture respectful. "Mr. Vaughan," he said quietly, "I hope everything is to your satisfaction." Richard did not look at him immediately, his attention still partially anchored elsewhere. Then he turned, meeting the man's gaze with a calm that carried a different kind of authority now, not sharp, not performative, but grounded. "It is," he replied. Then after a brief pause, he added, "Your staff is exceptional." The manager blinked, just once, the compliment landing in a space he had not prepared for. "Thank you, sir," he said, though his tone carried a trace of uncertainty, as if unsure whether the words were meant as praise or something else. Richard's gaze shifted back toward the floor, following Lila once more as she moved with the same quiet confidence, and this time, when he spoke, it was not to challenge, not to test, but to clarify something that had begun to take shape within him. "Do you know who trained her?" he asked, his voice even, the question directed but not confrontational. The manager hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward Lila before returning. "She mentioned her father once," he said carefully. "But she does not speak about it much." Richard nodded slowly, the answer aligning with what he had already begun to understand, that what she carried was not something displayed, but something lived, something earned through time and experience, not granted by position or environment, and that realization settled deeper than he expected. It touched something quieter, something reflective, something that did not come easily to him. Across the room, Lila turned briefly, her gaze passing over the tables, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met again, not held, not prolonged, but enough to confirm that the shift between them was real, not imagined, not temporary, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed, not agreement, not familiarity, but recognition, the kind that does not need words to exist. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly, and as he did, the room around him seemed to settle into a new balance, one that no longer centered on control or status, but on something quieter, something more enduring, and for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about what he could command from the world, but what he had just been shown by someone he had almost dismissed. The night moved forward, but not in the same way it had begun. The polished rhythm of the restaurant now carried something quieter beneath it, something that did not belong to routine or expectation, and Richard Vaughan sat in the middle of it, no longer commanding the space, but observing it with a clarity he had not anticipated. His plate had been served, the aroma rising gently, the presentation flawless, yet he found himself taking his time, not out of habit, but out of thought, each movement slower, more deliberate, as though he was no longer rushing toward the next decision, but allowing the moment to unfold. Across the room, Lila continued her work, moving from table to table with the same composed efficiency, but now, in the subtle glances of those who had witnessed the exchange, there was something new, not pity, not surprise, but respect, quiet and unspoken, the kind that settles without announcement. The man in the charcoal suit lifted his glass slightly in her direction as she passed, a small gesture, easily missed, but intentional, and she acknowledged it with the slightest nod, her expression unchanged, her focus steady. Richard noticed that too, not the gesture itself, but the way she received it, without seeking it, without holding on to it, as if her sense of self did not depend on recognition, but remained constant regardless of it. He set his fork down, the soft clink against the plate barely audible, and leaned back slightly, his gaze finding her again, and this time, when she approached his table once more to check on his meal, there was no tension waiting for her, no test hidden beneath his words, only presence. "Everything is excellent," he said before she could ask, his voice even, but carrying a sincerity that did not require emphasis. Lila inclined her head. "I am glad to hear that, sir," she replied, her tone calm, consistent, and for a brief moment, they stood in a space that no longer needed to prove anything, a space built on something quieter, something more grounded. Richard hesitated, just for a second, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small, simple card, not flashy, not ostentatious, but unmistakably deliberate. He placed it on the edge of the table, not sliding it toward her, not forcing the gesture, simply placing it there as an option. "If you ever decide that for now it is no longer enough," he said, his voice steady, meeting her gaze directly, "there may be a place where what you know is valued the way it should be." The words were not an offer wrapped in superiority, not a rescue, not a favor, but something closer to recognition. An acknowledgement of potential that had already been proven. Lila's eyes flickered briefly to the card, then back to him, and for the first time, there was a pause in her response, not hesitation, but consideration, real and present. She did not reach for it immediately. She did not react with surprise or gratitude. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing not the opportunity, but the intention behind it. Then she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I will think about it." And that was all. No promise, no acceptance, only truth. And somehow, that made the gesture more meaningful, not less. Richard nodded in return, accepting her answer without expectation, without pressure, and as she turned to continue her work, the bracelet at her wrist caught the light one last time, not as a symbol of where she had come from, but as a quiet reminder of everything she carried forward. The card remained on the table for a moment, untouched. Then, as she passed by again minutes later, she picked it up with the same calm precision she had shown all evening, slipping it into her apron without breaking her stride, and in that simple motion, something completed itself, not an ending, but a beginning, one that neither of them fully defined, but both understood. And as Richard Vaughan finished his meal, the room around him returning to its familiar rhythm, he knew that the most important thing that had happened that night had not been ordered, not been planned, but had been revealed, quietly, clearly, and in a way he would not forget.